Do you know what happened to the American buffalo? It's considered one of the most infamous conservation horror stories in American history, period.
On the South Platte, hunters built fires to keep the buffalo from water at night and killed them as they came to slake their thirst by day. 1875 saw the end. In 1875, the great southern herd was gone. By 1882, the Northern Pacific Railroad was built, and 5,000 hunters and skinners were emptying the northern range.
Some 40 million buffalo were purposefully slaughtered by the U.S. Army and other hired hunters because
Colonel Dodge had said, "Every buffalo dead is an Indian gone." And buffalo extermination was the unwritten policy in the winning of the West.
Many indigenous people starved after their main food source was eradicated, including the Blackfeet, who suffered starvation winters. The worst claimed some 700 lives in the winter of 1883 to 84. By contrast, 42 people perished in the Donner Party, and that story is still taught in history class in middle schools around the country to this day. By 1895, starving and desperate to save their children, the Blackfeet offered to sell lands they didn't even personally believe any man could own to the U.S. government, lands that would eventually become Glacier National Park. When Chief Whitecalf bitterly accepted the agreement, he was quoted as saying, "Chief Mountain is my head. Now my head is cut off. The mountains have been my last refuge." The sale included an agreement that the Blackfeet could hunt, fish, gather, and carry out their traditional rituals on the lands. But these subsistence rights were extinguished after the lands were officially designated as a national park, and the agreement was, air quotes, reinterpreted by the government. Removed from their most sacred spot, the Blackfeet were given a reservation on the border of the park. In the years that followed, the Great Northern Railway, whose Western Star locomotives were also proudly referred to as Empire Builders, recalling the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Star of Empire, ran a rail line directly through the Blackfeet Reservation. The railway erected luxury lodges throughout Glacier, including the massive Mini Glacier Hotel, a place that would only be open from June to September each year, then close for the winter for even longer than the Overlook did in The Shining. The railroad then billed the Montana Park as America's Alps, or America's Switzerland, further psychologically blunting the edges of the Wild West to offer travelers European-style architecture and civilization.
There's a modern hotel and everything looks very comfortable, and is very comfortable.
Chalets and waitresses wearing dirndls, who served guests dessert while the orchestra played a waltz or a foxtrot.
The waitresses at Glacier Park Hotel dress in Swedish costumes.
The hotel was once again mostly furnished in a rustic wilderness style, with copious bearskins draped over everything and buffalo skulls hanging up everywhere, although also overlaid with Japanese lanterns for some reason. These lodges provided luxuries at the edge of nowhere, such as a barber shop, tailor shop, hospital, hot and cold running water, and telephones. In the 1970 Glacier National Park Historic Resource Study, James Shear wrote, "The Great Northern hotels were not simply rows of rooms where the tired traveler spent the night and hurried on the next morning. They were theaters, stages adorned with the props of wilderness, where the guest and participant could assume a role in the frontier past of Jim Bridger, General Custer, Sitting Bull, and Lewis and Clark. They had atmosphere." Sounds a lot like Westworld. This created atmosphere included the Blackfeet Indians, who were offered menial wages to set up teepees near park lodges and greet train passengers as publicity stunts for a massive advertising campaign.
There's an Indian encampment nearby. We're on the edge of the great Blackfeet Reservation. And it's like turning back the pages of history to watch them sing and dance. The Blackfeet were once the terror of the North, but the tide of civilization has swept over them.
Another synthetic prop in the supposedly natural setting. Blackfeet tribal members, who had basically been turned into mascots for their own dispossession, were generally barred from entering these hotels, which is painfully ironic considering one of the most notable decorations in Mini Glacier, for example, was a huge 180-foot canvas mural painted by Blackfeet chiefs illustrating the tribe's history. Blackfeet, which came to be referred to as the Glacier Park Tribe for a while, were also extensively used on flyers and promotional materials for the park, the railroad, and its hotels. After spending the day singing and dancing for tourists, white employees would bring out kitchen scraps to feed the hungry native performers each night. Blackfeet elder and artist Daryl Norman described the spectacle as, in some ways, very humiliating, just to satisfy the curiosity of the traveler.
It is not easy to realize the challenge that moving westward meant to these people. Even though they knew the danger, it was a complete uprooting of their lives.
Similar stories of using treaties that were ultimately broken to remove indigenous people can be found all across the nation, including in Oregon, the state where the pyramidal-shaped Timberline Lodge sits under Illumination Rock at the foot of Mount Hood, Oregon's highest point settled within the Mount Hood National Forest. The mountain is named for Samuel Hood, 1st Viscount Hood, a British admiral at the Battle of the Chesapeake, and sits partly inside the reservation of the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs. These tribes signed a treaty back in 1855 that ceded 10 million acres of land to the government in exchange for a piece for their reservation and the rights to fish, hunt, gather berries and roots, and pasture livestock on the ceded lands. Just a decade later, a superintendent with Indian Affairs met with the tribes on the pretense that they were signing an agreement that tribal members would need to carry a written pass when leaving their reservation to use the ceded lands. What the Senate went on to ratify, however, was a supplemental treaty that claimed the tribe abused their use rights and therefore relinquished them to the government. When the tribes learned this was a supplemental treaty, they insisted the document they were presented with said nothing at all about relinquishing their rights. Despite never being officially enforced, the dispute over this deception and the use of this so-called supplemental treaty against these tribes apparently continues to this day.
But again and again, the pioneers had to be on a sharp lookout for attacks. Their struggle for survival against the Indians was never ending. They were a relentless enemy who resented the coming of the white settlers. They fought tooth and nail for every foot of ground, exacting a terrible toll. Just as hard as the Indians fought, so did the pioneers who needed the land for their families and for freedom.
The peak of Mount Hood and its upper slopes are located in a protected area inside the Mount Hood National Forest that was actually dedicated the Mount Hood Wilderness Area in 1964. The supposed pristine Eden of these national parks was further codified for the, quote, permanent good of the whole people in the Wilderness Act of 1964, which placed a legally binding protective overlay on 9 million acres of national parks, forests, and other government lands. The act portrays these lands as though they were always an unpeopled landscape, the most telling language defining wilderness as hereby recognized as an area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man, where man himself is a visitor who does not remain. And further, an area of undeveloped land retaining its primeval character and influence without permanent improvements or human habitation. Not only does this act completely separate humans from nature, but gives the impression of a pure, natural landscape devoid of humans in complete contradiction to thousands of years of known history. As Isaac Cantor wrote in Public Land and Resources Law Review, national parks do not preserve what the West was, they preserve a West which never was. The entire national park system has been presented to Americans as a patriotic conservation project for a virgin wilderness, a showcase of nature in its primeval, untouched state. But this is a complete illusion. Cantor continues, these landscapes were inhabited, their features named, their forests utilized, their plants harvested, and animals hunted. Native Americans have a history in our national parks measured in millennia. They were forcibly removed, and later treaty rights to traditional use, such as hunting and fishing, were erased, often without acknowledgement or compensation. Immediately after these removals, the parks were advertised as a showcase of uninhabited America, nature's handiwork unspoiled. Keep America clean, am I right? It's uncanny to be in a place once inhabited by people for thousands of years, only for them to be purged, and then for everyone else to pretend like they were never there in the first place. Uncanny how you can't shake the feeling of being watched the whole time you're playing on the playground.
While the pioneers fought for their lives and their hard-won land, speculators living in splendor in the eastern cities had their eyes on these rich new areas, and by political and financial power were able to seize or acquire legal rights to land they had never seen. They could destroy the hard work of the pioneer who had no recourse but to accept the decree of their own government.
And today the U.S. government owns the majority of Oregon. In fact, the government owns 47% of all land in the West. The civilizing of the Wild West can be typified in this iconic 1872 painting by John Gast, titled American Progress. It depicts the goddess Columbia, adorned with the Star of Empire on her forehead, carrying the line of the telegraph and leading settlers westward by trains and in covered wagons, driving the Indians at Buffalo out of the picture. As manifest destiny, a concept embodying the 19th century American drive to remake the Wild West in the image of the American East, takes hold. Back in 1963, historian Frederick Merck wrote that manifest destiny was born out of a sense of mission to redeem the old world by high example, generated by the potentialities of a new earth for building a new heaven. How many people ever notice the goddess is carrying a school book under her right arm? Quite a fancy way of dressing up imperialism. An imperialism that never stopped once America's borders were officially mapped. And yet, even still, the early beginnings of this now centuries-old history hardly ever gets seen for what it really was, what it really is, as a narrow slice of a very one-sided history continues to get plastered over the truth. As historian and author Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz puts it, the myth persists not for a lack of free speech or poverty of information, but rather for an absence of motivation to ask questions that challenge the core of the scripted narrative of the origin story. How might acknowledging the reality of U.S. history work to transform society?
With heartbreak, but yet with stout hearts, the American pioneer overcame even the barriers erected by men, and won and settled new lands and made new homes westward.
There are all kinds of these removals. They could all be termed as trails of tears. I think the Trail of Tears, I know it's an enigmatic sort of statement and title. I don't like it. It kind of avoids the harshness of that situation, doesn't it? It makes it kind of seem like poetry. It's not poetry. You are literally removing these people from their lands forever and taking away all they know and literally impoverishing them and placing them on a reservation where they have nothing and they're completely under the control of the U.S. government.
This is the heritage which is America, a heritage drawn from many peoples, all of whom had one purpose, to build for themselves and their children a land of freedom from oppression and prejudice.
Well, sometimes I can see things that happened a long time ago. I think a lot of things happened right here in this particular hotel over the years, and not all of them was good.
Broken treaties, buried history calling out silently just under the surface. And like Stephen King wrote and Kubrick flaunts in our faces on screen in The Shining, the Indian is everywhere in these parks, and hardly anyone sees or acknowledges them. Perhaps that's why Kubrick chose to put up so many Calumet cans on the Overlook's pantry shelf.
Calumet is a noun, French, out of Latin, defined as a kind of pipe used by the North American Indians as a symbol of peace. To accept a calumet is to agree to the terms of peace, and to refuse it is to reject them. The calumet of peace is used to seal and ratify contracts or alliances. Calumet baking powder, however, is double acting. This was always a double game. A devil's bargain. Throughout the main hallways of the hotel where the guest rooms are, the staff wing, and at the major exits, there are kitsch paintings of Native Americans here and there, every once in a while just watching in the background. It's a blatantly stark contrast to the main areas of the hotel, such as the games room, lounge, and lobby, the walls of which are practically crammed with more modern framed black and white photos, so many they're basically another character in the film, overlaid and slapped down on the innate native background. The thing that bugged me was that he was bringing all this up because he loved the GD Hotel so much, the beautiful overlook, the traditional overlook, the bloody sacred overlook. Well, I found a scrapbook in the basement. Somebody had put together all the less savory aspects of Ullman's Cathedral, and it looked to me like a little black mass had been going on after hours. Jack Torrance, from The Shining. But this damaging cycle, this deadly recursive loop, isn't just repeated on decimated native populations destroyed and forgotten. This was just the beginning, a foundation. It's a repeating pattern so thoroughly woven into our society, we hardly notice it anymore. In the power structure, in the workplace, in the family and cycles of abuse handed down and perpetuated generation after generation. And within the individual, who suppresses his or her own identity in order to kiss ass and climb the social ladder in a desperate act to belong, until people don't even know themselves anymore, if they ever did in the first place. This is a society that has so much food in the pantry it could eat a different menu every day for a year, and yet it eats its own. A uniquely American story.
And this is the environment,
This is the environment.
where we are taught not to face the uncomfortable past, to accept it,
To accept and not react to violence,
to make excuses and try to justify it, to ignore it,
or to ignore it altogether, pretend it never happened,
pretend it never happened, and dutifully go about our day. The social norms are set within a certain parameter.
a certain boundary. And if you want to get anywhere in this society,
Want to get anywhere in this society, you better stay within the lines
you better see only what you're taught to see
and keep your eyes wide shut,
and keep your eyes wide shut to everything else.
to silence that little voice inside
Picking up on all the warning signs and practically screaming,
and practically screaming at us that something ain't right here.
See? It's okay. Saw it on the television.
our brains receive and process sense information from our environment in order to build a model of that environment. A map we base our decisions and resultant behaviors on in order to continue living and surviving in this place. But the map is not the territory. What happens when things keep getting moved ever so slightly out of the corner of our eyes and behind our backs so that we can never fully grasp where we truly are? And that's the maze we're all trapped in. The maze that exists, but doesn't exist, in the Overlook Hotel.